Frame narratives! This is what we're learning about today, so I hope you're excited because I sure am. Frame narratives. What are they? Why use them? What's the point? Let's start off with a simple definition. A frame narrative is essentially a story within a story. That could be a story within a story in a book, in a movie, in a TV show, any form of media that you are able to use to tell a story. This is a very common storytelling device. You've probably seen it before, but when you encounter it, having not learned about it, it can be a little bit confusing, especially when you encounter it in a book that is otherwise a little bit difficult to read and understand, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So let's look at a visual example. Why is it called a frame narrative? The reason it's called a frame narrative is because when you illustrate it, it looks like picture frames. It has a frame-like structure. So think of a picture frame, or think of a frame for a post on Visco or Instagram. We're going to come back to this idea of physical frames, but the big thing that you have to keep in mind is that the number of narrators between the story and the reader increases with each frame. That also means that with each story that is introduced, the story is further away from the reader than the previous story. When I say further, and when I talk about distance between the reader and the story, we're really looking to see distance between what tense the story is told in. So is the story in the present, or is it in the past, or is it far in the past? And also the perspective. So who is telling us the story, and did that person directly experience the story, or are they telling us someone else's account? So with Frankenstein, we actually have 3 different stories. We have a double frame narrative. The main narrative, which is the present, is the one narrated by Walton. It's his set of letters that he is writing to his sister. The reader is closest to this story in Frankenstein because it's told in the present, and Walton is the one relaying his experience to us. He is a primary source on his own experience. However, then Walton meets Victor Frankenstein, and Victor Frankenstein starts to tell Walton a story, and then Walton is telling us the story that Victor Frankenstein told to him. That's where we get our first frame story, which takes place in the past, and which is Frankenstein's story, told by Frankenstein to Walton, who then tells it to us. So now we're farther away from it because it has to go through 2 people in order to get to us. And then, just to make matters even more complicated, we have a third frame story, which is the past with another point of view, the creature's point of view. So now we have the story of the creature, of Frankenstein's creation, and what he went through after he was created. And he tells that story to Frankenstein, who tells that story to Walton, who tells that story to us, the reader. So we are furthest from this inner frame narrative. So now we understand what a frame narrative is, but why use them? Obviously, they're more complicated. Why not just have Frankenstein tell us his story directly? Why have Walton at all? Well, there are a few reasons why authors choose to use frame narratives. The first one is obviously to give context. Give context for all the stories involved by telling us more about the background of the story and the character or the narrator in that story. So with Walton's story, for example, the first story that we encounter, we learn about Walton, for one. We learn about what he values, what is troubling him because he's writing this letter to his sister. And then he meets Frankenstein, so we also learn about what attracts Walton because Walton is very intrigued by Frankenstein when he meets him. We also learn about Frankenstein from Walton's perspective because we learn about how Frankenstein comes off to other people. Because oftentimes people are very bad at knowing how other people perceive them. Then, when we get into Frankenstein's narrative, we get context for his own story. We get more about his childhood that only he could know. But then when we get into the monster's story, we get a really interesting perspective because we get perspective about the monster's actual attitude towards family and towards his own existence. Another thing to keep in mind is narrator unreliability. when we have multiple perspectives. These narrators are not just narrators, but they're also characters within the story. So these characters have their own motivations, they have their own agendas, and they are biased. They're not necessarily telling us something objective. They are telling us a story that they want us to hear. Because they're narrators, they have control over the story, and they have control over what parts of the story we see, how we see them, and what parts of the story we don't see. The third reason for using a framed narrative is that it can reflect or emphasize something thematic in the story. In other words, the act of having to dig deeper for the true story through multiple perspectives and multiple timelines can reflect confusion or an inner struggle in the protagonists. And that's certainly the case with Shelley's Frankenstein. The thing that I want to talk about first, because I think it's the most fun, is that idea of unreliable narrators or manipulation. Authors are out to control your mind. Not completely, but they are out to control how you consume their stories. Good authors don't just think about the plot of their story, but also how readers are going to perceive and think about or struggle with the way the story is presented. Gothic literature especially aims to recreate the feeling of the sublime, which is what we talked about yesterday. And sublime is purely feeling based because it's the whole idea of encountering something that you can only understand through feeling and you can't explain rationally. So in order to recreate a feeling with words, you have to recreate the conditions that allow that feeling to exist by manipulating the reader's state of mind through narrative techniques, like a frame narrative. You're trying to get the reader to trust the narrator, and then trust a second narrator, and then trust a third narrator. But when those narrators sometimes contradict each other, you're put into a state of confusion and you're asked to look closer at what the story might actually be. Let's look at a visual example of this. Talking about physical frames. Just like how framing can affect how someone views an image, literary framing affects how someone views a story, and even how much of the story someone sees. So let's look at this first picture. A little pig with blonde hair holding up a sign. So let's say someone gave you this picture and said, oh, it's a part of a larger picture, but this is the picture that I wanted to give you. What would you think the picture is of? What is this picture about? I'd say it's about this blonde little pig. But let's say that someone else takes that same picture and gives you this version with a different frame. Now, there's a lot more than the blonde pig. So we've been given more of the story. But not only have we been given more of the story, but we've been given something else to focus on. Maybe in looking at this image, you decide to focus on that blonde pig, or maybe you decide to focus on something different. Let's say someone else comes along and has looked at the same picture and gives you this version. So here, we have even more of the picture and more things to focus on. Looking at this at first glance, if you hadn't seen that blonde pig before, you might not even notice her this time. And that's nothing compared to the full picture. When we're given the full picture without any frame, we don't know what to focus on. No one's telling us what to focus on. It's going to take multiple readings and a lot of studying in order to identify every single component of this image. But if we're told to focus on various things individually, that can change how we consume the story on our first reading. Another thing to remember is that story structures can also reflect meaning. So what I mean by that is frame narrative as a thematic reflection. The story's physical structure can represent the author's intended meaning. So looking back at the frame narrative in Frankenstein, there are layers to this narrative. Shelley tells this story in layers. So when you're thinking about how does the structure, this layered frame structure, reflect meaning in the story, well, what else is layered in the story? People are certainly layered. Ideas can be layered. So that's the first place to start. Other questions to consider is, well, first of all, what is Shelley trying to tell the reader through Frankenstein? What actually is her message? Luckily, even though Frankenstein is a little bit difficult, that part should be pretty easy because you can look at how she communicates that message directly. Victor Frankenstein explicitly tells us what the moral is several times throughout the story. But just because a character directly tells us what we're supposed to be getting out of the book doesn't mean that that's all there is. You also need to look at how does she communicate this message or emphasize it indirectly through the story's frame structure. So in looking at that, think about this. Why give us three perspectives? Why not just have Victor Frankenstein tell us the story? Or why not just have the monster tell us the story directly? Why have Walton at all? What does each perspective give to us that a single perspective does not? When looking at how they work in combination with each other, think about what each perspective is missing. What can Walton not tell us that Frankenstein does? What can Frankenstein not tell us that the creature can tell us? What do these narratives, as we get progressively closer to the center and then zoom back out, add to the story that we didn't have in the first place?